Welcome to Your Money Today, a unique look at financial, geopolitical, and other news relevant to you. For 45 years now, your host, Chris Temple, has provided his one of a kind insights and advice on the markets and on our world. Whatever the subject, he calls them like he sees them. Roll up your sleeves with Chris as we get into today's program.
Welcome back, folks. Chris Temple here with you on this newest issue of Your Money Today. We'll also have this on my YouTube channel. We'll have it on our strategic NPR channel and the podcast sites and elsewhere. So wherever you're listening to this, welcome. Today, what I want to talk about, no, the title is not just pure hyperbole or clickbait or something like that, but truly, if President-elect Donald Trump embraces the handful of things I'm going to outline in this roadmap, he will be one of the most transformative presidents of our lifetime, frankly, the most transformative, and maybe one of the most transformative of all times, not only benefiting the United States of America, but the world in reordering our priorities as a nation, how we spend money, how we borrow money. Unfortunately, we're going to talk about that, and a whole lot of other things. America and the world can be a better place if Donald Trump embraces the things we're going to talk about today. You know, the time for, carping and ridiculing Kamala Harris and the Democrats is over. They're on their way out. The Democrat Party's got its own mess to clean up. We don't need to worry about that. There's a lot of work to do, and it needs to be done fast. I've said in a few of my conversations on the prior issue of Your Money Today, as well as with several of my colleagues who I've been a guest with in the last several days. You've all seen links to those conversations if you're on our list or follow us on social media. But this is something that needs to be done fast. President Trump has got much more of a mandate, assuming, again, and we still don't know this, I'm recording this on Sunday, November 10th, there's still 20 House seats that have not been decided. If the Republicans get 5 or more of those, as I'm recording this, they will still hang on to the House of Representatives. So, especially if that is the case, and it looks like it is, when you look at the way some of these undecided seats are leading, President Trump's going to have Republican leadership in the House, Republican leadership in the Senate, but he's got 2 years, not 4, he's got 2 years to really do enough and get enough set in motion that the country will be staying behind him, if not even more so than we all just evidenced on Election Day this past week. He can start a counter-revolution, frankly, against the forces, and this is important to note. There has been a lot of people saying, well, President Trump was trying to overthrow our democracy, trying to do this, trying to do that. Our constitutional republic that the framers gave us back when has already been overthrown. And all of the efforts against it now, which hopefully will, all told, have some success, are against, they're really a counter-revolution against the emergence, especially since the end of World War II, of this Leviathan government that we have, the administrative and bureaucratic state, the CIA and the security state that we have, the military-industrial complex where we have a budget larger on so-called defense. It's not defending anything, it's offensive in most cases, but a defense budget that is greater than something like the next 20 countries spending on defense combined. After that, this is what President Trump is against. That's why I commented a couple of times this week already that anytime you have heard in recent months that he is a threat to our democracy's on the ballot, etc., take the word democracy out and substitute bureaucracy, substitute deep state, substitute military-industrial complex. That is what was threatened. And now is threatened a bit more that President Trump has been reelected, only the second time in our country's history of a president elected to a second non-consecutive term, the other being, of course, Grover Cleveland. So this is the battle that's out there. This is what Donald Trump has taken on, and a lot of good people are going to be taking on with him. all of us, and not the least of which President Trump himself, will always need to be mindful of the fact that whereas the outgoing President Joe Biden and his Vice President Kamala Harris, there was no idiocy that came out of their mouth. There was no policy that they did that ruined this country, that they were not either forgiven for or had ignored by the legacy media. President Trump is going to be facing the opposite of that. He is going to be under a microscope. Whatever the legacy media and his opponents, mostly in the Democrat Party, come up, whatever they can come up with to nail him on, they'll do it, right or wrong. So it's going to be a very, very different attitude. Thankfully, the president, as we saw in the run-up to his reelection and in his reelection, will have what Elon Musk, I think, has called the new citizen media, citizen journalism on his side, where we can get up to the second information that is a whole lot more truthful, whatever they might want to say to the contrary, than what the establishment and legacy media were putting out. So that is going to be one thing that will be on the president's side, is that there will be ways to know who is telling the truth out there. And don't think for a minute, and I've already been happy to see this in the last couple or 3 days, that whether it's Twitter, whether it's, of course, True Social is really speaking to the choir, but Twitter primarily, some other places secondarily, President Trump is not going to get a free pass even from his allies if it's believed that something bad is going to happen or is happening. And case in point, and I don't know how much substance there was to this, whether President Trump was thinking about this seriously or not. But as it came out that, for example, Mike Pompeo, who is a backstabber if there ever was one, who is a swamp creature if there ever was one, was perhaps being contemplated for a new cabinet position or renewed one, as the case may be, by the president, there was a hue and cry that went up on social media. Bobby Kennedy, to his credit, said absolutely not. Don't betray your what you're doing before you even get sworn in by bringing people like this back in again, etc. And so finally, yesterday, the president announced that no, he thanks them for their past service and wishes them well, but neither Mike Pompeo nor Nikki Haley are going to be having a place in a second Trump administration. That's the way it should be, and we're going to keep an eye out for that. The next indication coming up as to whether the rank and file in the Senate are going to be more helpful than a hindrance to President Trump will be Wednesday, when we're going to have scheduled a secret ballot to decide who the next Senate Majority Leader is going to be. The longest serving swamp creature who led the Republicans in the Senate, Mitch McConnell, had already announced that he would not be the Majority Leader going forward. His hand-picked successor is John Thune from South Dakota. A close second, but also a rhino, is John Cornyn from Texas. Both of them have backbones like limp noodles. They go whichever way the wind blows. They are not to be trusted. The one who has been talked about the most, whose hat is in the ring, is Rick Scott from here in Florida, who also had a pretty comfortable margin of victory when he was just reelected, and who, unlike both Thune and Cornyn, has not been a backstabber, and who is on board with the agenda that President Trump has. So we'll see what happens on Wednesday. I don't know yet if the president will come out himself, given this is a secret ballot. I would suspect that if he has a favorite, he may be making a few phone calls or whatnot behind the scenes. Well, we'll see what happens. But I'm certainly hopeful that we have the kind of leadership in the Senate and then later in the House, if it comes to that, which it looks like it will, that are going to be more helpful than a hindrance, as I said, to President Trump after he's sworn in and has a very, very, very tall order to really get this country turned around. Over the last few months, some of the content that we put out, whether on a National Investor or Strategic NPR, You should always be making sure that you follow both of our YouTube channels as well as our podcast networks that we're on now with Your Money Today and otherwise. But some of the discussions I entitled a roadmap. And this, of course, was chiefly for investors to give some realistic assessments of things depending on how the election had turned out, what policy would most likely look like, and give the knowledge of these things to investors so that they knew whether to zig or zag on different themes and ideas and sectors and so forth, depending on what the outcome was. This one I want to offer respectfully and with great hope and prayer to President Trump and the people around him, because this is a roadmap which, if followed, will make Donald Trump one of the greatest presidents in U.S. history and meaningfully give back the country to the people and give the world back to a regimen of peace and good commerce rather than the war and conflict we've had so much that's really been enabled by the people who he is now in battle with, again, in Washington, D.C., primarily. So I want to go down a list of a few things. We're going to talk about these things in fairly general terms. I'll expand on a few of them, especially when it comes to the idea of a national infrastructure bank or sovereign wealth fund or both, as well as enterprise zones and things like that that could come after it. And last but not least, and I teased about this on my social media over the last couple of days, a different approach to currency. And I did that, of course, via a picture of not a Federal Reserve note, but a United States note. We're going to get to all of that in just a minute. But first of all, I said before the election that whether it was President Trump or Vice President Harris who won, they were going to have a deck badly stacked against them right from the get-go. And I really made the analogy, as some of you saw, to what President Jimmy Carter inherited when he was sworn in 1977. He was blamed after the fact by history, still is to this day, for the inflation and then the resulting high interest rates that bedeviled much of his time in office. He had nothing to do with how those things got started. Those things got started by President Richard Nixon taking us off the gold standard in 1971, and more so, besides turning the dollar at that time into a fiat currency, when the rest of the world wasn't yet, so the dollar was uniquely bad. But then he unleashed Arthur Burns on the world, who was an utter disaster, much like several of the Fed chairmen have been since him, if not pretty much all of them, at one time or another. And he's the one that gave us first one wave of inflation, then it subsided, and then the next wave was worse than the first one. And Jerome Powell has even said this, the current Fed chairman, that he's trying to avoid this particular fate. The second big wave of inflation came because, due to political pressure, Burns acted too slowly to tamp out the first inflationary fire that he started back in the 70s. So anyway, it was a mess. So that was what Carter inherited. Today, President Trump is inheriting a nearly $36 trillion and counting national debt, $2+ trillion annual budget deficit, and perhaps also rising, all else being equal, if the economy slows further and we see less tax receipts come in. We'll talk about tax policy in a minute. And, the math is not friendly right now. And it didn't matter who got elected. The math is not friendly. So what is going to be done about all of this? And before I get to the core issue of the very nature of our monetary system and a Federal Reserve, where there's already been a public fight started, which we'll get to, looking at it under the auspices of what is conventional now, meaning everything continues as usual. Under that scenario, how do you start to keep your promise to reduce the deficit and pay down debt? Number one, there needs to be real cost savings in the budget. When Ronald Reagan was elected to replace Jimmy Carter, he set up what was called the Grace Commission, the official $12 name was the president's private sector survey on cost control. J. Peter Grace was the head of this thing. He was the chairman, hence the shorter, easier to remember name. A lot of other, big shots, corporate heads, and so forth. One of them, I've told the story a million times. Those of you who are old enough remember, of course, Harry Figge, another CEO, head of a Fortune 500 company himself, was so alarmed by what he saw as far as the waste and fraud and abuse. And this, folks, was in the days when we had just reached our first 1 trillion in debt. But Figge was so alarmed by all of what he saw that he, on his own nickel, and his company's own nickel, was putting out, ads in all of the major press in the country, had a section in his written annual report of Figge International each year that dealt with the horrendous fiscal situation in America and so forth. Anyway, after the work of the Grace Commission was done, there was something 400 plus billion worth of savings that could have been realized, even if the Fed, or the government rather, maybe a Freudian slip there, even if the government was just run more like a business. They didn't really come out and say to wholesale cut a whole bunch of agencies and do this and that. And even with what they came out with, very little was acted upon. And therefore, as a result, and this isn't the only reason, but, the annual federal deficit when Reagan was elected was $40 billion, to use a round number. By the time he left office, it had increased more than fivefold. And it's only gotten worse since then. So, and that, too, was as tax receipts during the 8 years of the Reagan presidency went up substantially. So the Laffer curve is true. It's a real thing. If you reduce tax rates, yes, you bring in more money to the government, all else being equal. But if government spending is going up at a faster rate, your deficit goes up more. Duh. And that's what we've seen all this time. Today now, by appearances, I don't think anything has officially been decided, but by all appearances, Elon Musk is going to be running what has been called the Department of Government Efficiency, D.O.G.E., a cute throwback to that little doggy looking thing that's a cryptocurrency emblem. We'll see how serious everybody is going to be. I get the idea when Musk says he can find $2 trillion in savings, which I guess in inflation-adjusted terms is probably even less than what the Grace Commission came up with, but it would put a meaningful dent in things. Let's see what he does. Certainly President Trump would be on board with it. I think Republicans running the House and Senate will be on board. And folks, this isn't doing away with entire departments and stuff necessarily yet, although a lot of that needs to come too. But this is a way in which, all of these people who over this 80 years of the growth of this Leviathan state have built this colossus, this infrastructure in Washington, where they all have big jobs, they all feel entitled. I saw a meme the other day that was appropriate, and they said, here's what we have now, and it shows one guy digging a hole in a street and 10 guys around him just standing watching. That's what we have now in Washington. That what we need to have after the Department of Government Efficiency gets done is the one guy digging a hole and maybe one guy above him who is calling the shots. We don't need all the rest of them. They need to go out and get jobs in the private sector. That can be arranged. In fact, we're going to talk about how that's going to be arranged in just a minute, etc. So that needs to be done. All right. Number two, and I'm going to get to this in a minute, but I'm going to mention it now. As of today, the annualized run rate for interest on the $36 trillion national debt, I think, is up to something like $1.25 trillion per year. Now it's even higher than the defense budget. By the end of this year, all else being equal, it will be something like $1.5 trillion annual interest payments this year. That cannot continue. And again, in just a minute, I'm going to leave this off to the side for now. We're going to get to how we're no longer going to have to borrow money for public needs. Moving on from that and focusing on one particular aspect of the Leviathan state is that unlike what happened during Trump 1.0, where you promised us, Mr. President, you would put NATO on a scrap heap of history where it belongs, you would get rid of a lot of these different agencies and whatnot that have militarized the world. You would whittle the military down to size. By the time you left after your first term, the military budget annually was again in a new record. That needs to change. You've surrounded yourself with people that make me believe, and have made millions of your fellow Americans who voted for you believe, that you're serious this time about reining that in. I hope that is true, because without gutting the deep state, the military-industrial complex, and changing the world away from this idea that we've always got to be prepared for massive war. Imagine, and you've said it yourself, and your great Vice President-elect J.D. Vance has said it, and so have a lot of other people around you. Imagine if all the money that has been blown criminally, forget needlessly, criminally, just on Ukraine, that could have been used for so many more good, productive things, rather than just adding money to the national debt, while hundreds of thousands of people have lost their lives over a war that should never have happened. So that cannot be off the table. That needs to be at the top of the list as far as priorities. Okay? I don't know if all of the different things you're going to be confronted with will allow you to really go nutso on a lot of these other things, like Javier Milei has been able to do with some great success in Argentina. There's some disadvantages institutionally, maybe. There's some advantages. There's, I don't know. There might be some things you can do even beyond what he has done. But at least there's an example, and I know that you have followed him and admire what he's done, and you, of course. I think that with that kind of a spirit to come in and to always be ready to explain to the people why this is in their interest, because you've already, before you started, have got the deep state and the Leviathan state and the administrative state screaming like stuck pigs, because they're going to be out of jobs. The gravy train is hopefully ending for them. So all of that needs to be done, because here's the bottom line. If all you're going to do is continue the military spending but rearrange priorities, if you're going to rely solely on warmed over trickle-down economics and tax cuts, which, yes, are net benefits, no question about that. But if you're not ready to tackle all of this other stuff, and you're going to relive for all of us what happened to Reagan, and yes, tax receipts went up, but the debt kept going up, and federal spending every year kept going up, it's not going to work. So that's something that I hope and pray that, Mr. President, you embrace. And now let's move on to the Federal Reserve and the nature of our debt and monetary system, because this is where everything you do going forward is either going to sink or swim. Because I'll tell you right now, and I'll replay this thing in 2 years if you're facing a problem in the midterm elections, because the debt keeps going up, the economy is weakened, interest rates are up, inflation has rebounded, etc. Okay, without taking on the Fed head on properly, and frankly, in some respects, doing an end run around it, you will not succeed with everything else you're trying to do. And it's not an opinion, it's simple mathematics. We have a situation in our country where fractional reserve banking is a fatally flawed system. As time goes on, you have to borrow more and more money, and you get less and less out of it, because it's just the nature of banking, period. You cannot have this endless system where debt piles on top of debt piles on top of debt, and as time goes on, it becomes really an insurmountable task to even service the debt, let alone pay any of it off. All right? We have a world today, and I'm going to be putting out a lot more stuff on this subject and a couple other ones in the weeks and months ahead. But we have a situation where we have been put under the thumb in this country of a central bank that requires us to borrow what should be the public credit, our credit, that is for the betterment of the people, for a means of exchange, for public works and services and whatnot. We borrow it from a bank at interest, a bank that creates this credit out of thin air, Jerome Powell doesn't have a big vault of money, but he's got computers. And he's got an institution and a culture where we're not allowed to say the emperor has no clothes, where we're not allowed to say who's that man behind the curtain, what is he really doing. So we cannot continue down the road, no matter what our national priorities are, when everything starts with credit that is borrowed from a central bank being put in circulation. And if nothing else, Mr. President, I hope you'll go back, and I know that during your first term you had this, but you had a bust of President Andrew Jackson in the Oval Office. One of my sons is named for him because of my admiration for Andy Jackson, but go back and see what Andy Jackson thought about a central bank. Go back and see the reasons why he ran this den of vipers out of any ability to affect the public, because you might decide that maybe this is something that you need to do as well. Now, we heard this last week from Fed Chairman Powell in his press conference after the Fed meeting, that when he was asked, he very bluntly said no, that if you ask him to step down, the answer is no. You can't force him to do it, and of course legally you can't. You might be able to get, if there's something really bad that goes on, and you can get a majority of the Congress and to go along with you and the Senate, of course you can change the Federal Reserve Act. Okay, but something else that I would respectfully suggest that you need to avoid going forward is getting into any kind of a public pissing contest with him over monetary policy. If you've ever heard the term, they threw a party but nobody showed up, make that be his lot in life. Regrettably, at least for now, we have to live with the interest payable on that debt. We have to live with Jerome Powell. But going forward, there's nothing that says that you can't do an end run around the Federal Reserve in a variety of ways. Now, even today, with this discussion starting to percolate in a lot of areas, we're being reminded by the swamp, by the banking establishment, that, oh, wait a minute, we've got an independent central bank for a reason. When they were created in 1913, in the dark of night, literally, with a big chunk of Washington gone, couldn't stop them. We were told we needed the Federal Reserve because politicians on their own would just print money. Oh, really? The reason, the core reason why we've had the bad inflation we have in the last few years is because Jerome Powell and his crew printed something like 30% of all the U.S. dollars ever created in history in the space of about two plus years. Well, no wonder we had the inflation we did. Certainly a lot of Biden's policies didn't help, not the least of which is when one enabled the other and added in one fell swoop several trillion to the debt over COVID without a shred of anything attached to it that was productive that would have brought some of that money back by all of that added debt having given us anything, producing in the economy. It was all just throwing money out there, So anybody, whenever I have this discussion with someone and I talk about we need to have a national infrastructure bank, we need a national currency and a currency board, we don't need the Federal Reserve, okay? I'll say, well, yeah, but the Fed is independent and they're not inflationary. Bullshit on both counts, okay? The Fed is not independent. It has been the enabler of all of this deficit spending over time since that actually started in the early to mid 1980s. And what do you mean they're not political? I mean, that's nuts. The other thing is, and as I alluded to just with this post-COVID example, what has the Fed given us on several occasions since the 1913 Federal Reserve Act but a boom and bust economy? So don't let anybody tell you that, well, we need the Fed, they're sacrosanct. Yeah, you got a lot of good ideas, but they got to stay in place. No, they don't. All right, and if they stay in place, there's things you can do beyond that. Now, first off, President Trump, the odds are, even though I think that some of the things that you'll do early on will mitigate this, the odds are that we have had this artificial boom in the economy and the stock market for the last few years, thanks to all of this extra money that the Fed created. So odds are, and it wasn't going to matter whether you got in or Kamala Harris got in to some extent, forgive me for saying that, but the odds are that we're going to see a slowdown and it's going to be tougher to push the economy forward. What has always happened in the past during times like this is that there'll be a lot of make work stuff. There'll be fiscal stimulus and whatnot. The Fed might stimulate more, and we just continue to run up the debt. I do know that during the campaign you talked about the idea of a sovereign wealth fund, which is great. I think another great idea is one called a national infrastructure bank. You know, you were hamstrung for a lot of different reasons during your first term and never really did get that whole infrastructure thing taken care of. Now you've got a friendlier House and Senate that can help this. And I think that everybody involved needs to take a look at this idea of a national infrastructure bank. In one move, by creating and enabling something like this that is an off budget when you get right down to it. And for those of you listening, I've got a link to the site of the Commission for a National Infrastructure Bank. You've got the ability to do, in this regard, somewhat what President Roosevelt did with the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And I'm not going to get, for time's sake right now, into all the different nuances between one or the other. But a national infrastructure bank is one where trillions of dollars worth of infrastructure spending, high-paying jobs to provide that infrastructure. You throw in our energy needs for the future along with this. You throw in repairing and updating our dilapidated and extraordinarily vulnerable power grid all into this. You've got the ability with a bank like this, with this kind of initiative, to really do somewhat of an end run around the Federal Reserve in this particular regard, and have something that will be seeded largely, when all is said and done, by the private sector, contribute to all of these different things. Again, millions of better paying jobs. You broaden the tax base that way. You broaden the tax base with all of the work that is able to be done by this bank. But then the money coming in goes toward paying down debt as well. It's a win-win situation. The link is on this discussion. In future podcasts, I'm going to have some of the people directly from the Commission for National Infrastructure Bank. We'll talk about this exclusively to take a deeper dive. But this is one of the ways, Mr. President, that you can really be transformative and do something that is not dependent on the Fed and that will benefit the country at large and make extraordinary economic sense. And that's one of the ways that you indeed can and should make America wealthier and greater again. And then if you really want to galvanize this political realignment that you have been the proximate cause and start of, and solidify the Republican Party going forward as the party of common sense, the middle class, a strong economy, America first, and all the rest of this, what you next do with the National Infrastructure Bank, once it's set up, is that you, in a bipartisan fashion, in order to galvanize the renewed economic strength we'll have, to galvanize this political realignment, etc., and to galvanize this counter-revolution against the teat-sucking administrative state that does not produce anything but only takes like the parasites that they are from the public, is you go to each of the 435 members of the House of Representatives, Republican and Democrat and Independent alike, and you say to them, look, we're going to resurrect the idea of enterprise zones. And whether the need is that your district has been ruined by woke policies and we've got to literally clean up the streets and clean up infrastructure because of all of the homelessness and drug addiction and whatnot that has blighted some of our areas, whether it's in your district particularly, Madam Congresswoman, where the railroad tracks have not yet been fixed. We can think of Palatine, Ohio as one example, of course. And so many others in the country of railways, railroad stations, bridges, schools, everything. Give us your top 2 or 3 or 4 most yawning needs for building and rebuilding and fixing, and we'll set up 435 enterprise zones in each single congressional district, and those will at some point, as logistically and financially it can be done, will also be part of the work of the National Infrastructure Bank. Mr. President, if you do these things, you tell the Fed to go play off over there, fine. We're going to try and pay down what we owe them until we can muster the political support to completely abolish it. Okay? But if you start doing this, you're going to move the needle a lot towards not only a more prosperous economy, but the ability to pay down debt and do all of that kind of thing. Later, and you can ask Bobby Kennedy next time you visit him what his uncle did in that regard, get a reminder of that. But if despite all of the good intentions, and again, because time and mathematics are both going to be working against you early on, we may have a weak economy, we may have less robust tax receipts and other issues, etc. Ask Bobby to remind you about what a United States note is, because his uncle for a while put those out during his tragically shortened presidency, is a means for Americans to have a little bit more ability to pay for bills when there was a point in time that he wasn't getting sufficient help from the Fed. So take a look at that. Last but not least, and as I close for now, if you take these same principles to the world and you go after next, and this is a long list, I know, but if you next go after the institutions like the International Monetary Fund, like the World Bank. You know, I just read the other day, I don't know if this has come to your attention, Oxfam International found, and they're hardly a right-leaning organization or unfriendly to globalist objectives, they found that $41 billion just in supposed climate change funds have all of a sudden gone missing at the World Bank. Who would have thought that? Same things we've been hearing for years, whether it's going back to Don Rumsfeld during Bush Jr.'s administration, whether it's more recently with all of the hundreds of billions that have vanished over Ukraine. Back then it was over Iraq and Kuwait and Afghanistan. If we can show the world we're going to attack these things and get the IMF and the World Bank off their back, be an example to the rest of the world about how to manage money properly and manage public debt properly, get the bankers out of this that have enslaved people, get the CIA and the military out of it while we can, we will be, thanks to you, that shining city on a hill again, and you will not only have saved America, but you will have saved the world. These are the kinds of things that can and should be done quickly, at least get them underway, to show everybody that this is not a different Republican Party per se. This is not, rearranging the deck chairs on what are usual, in the past at least, Republican objectives. But this really is a counter-revolution. This really is a political realignment. And this really is going to be the Herculean task that you're taking on and you're going to follow through with in this second term to make the world a better, more prosperous, less debt-choked, and safer place for us all. And I wish you all the luck, and you have our prayers certainly from our household, and I think a lot of people listening to this as well.